This is the Pioneer Growing Point Agronomy Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and covering topics generated from our listeners.
On this episode, we will discuss alfalfa seeding preparation and also go through some final reminders before spring.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
Josh, we got a good show today, so we're going to go through some alfalfa management pieces. We're going to look at different ways we can seed when we go into spring here, and also, some of those management practices you need to do to make sure you get a good stand going. And after that, we're also going to hit on some other call-outs just before planting preparation, around CRW, sulfur, P&K, and just in general, what do we got to do before we go plant corn. So getting started, Josh, looking at alfalfa seeding here first. First thing you got to do if you're going to plant alfalfa is field preparation.
Yeah, and I think the first thing we want to look at before we get into it too much of detail is just looking back at, do we got the weeds under control? In most cases, a lot of our growers are coming out of probably corn or maybe some soybeans in some scenarios where the weed control has been pretty good. In some cases, we have some minimum tillage growers that do a lot of no-till where maybe weeds like dandelions or white cockle or shepherd's purse could be a concern. So anytime before we get into field preparation, we want to make sure we have some of those winter annual type weeds under control because they're the ones that we usually fight the most within the 2 to 3, 4 years of an alfalfa crop.
Yeah, and especially if it's not a glyphosate tolerant alfalfa crop, it's really hard to control broadleaves in a broadleaf crop like alfalfa. So having it clean before you get into it, that's the best thing you can do from the start.
Yeah, so in most cases, just getting a burn down application. If we got a few weeds out there, will get us where we need to be, followed by a good tillage pass to get it prepped, and we should be good to go. From there, Brian, I think it's important to look at what are the seeding depths. As we're getting the equipment ready to go, what kind of a seeding depth target are we looking for with alfalfa?
Yeah, so in most of the soil types we cover, especially in southern and central Minnesota, they're fairly heavy. So when you get into those type ground, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch is really your range, so that 3/8 inch is ideal. And that's really where you want to be to get good, even germination. You'll get enough moisture down there where if you're just sitting on top, moisture is going to be inconsistent. It might be tough to really get it to go.
Yeah, and from there, some other things, as we're getting ready for that, a lot of our growers locally do use cover crops. We do have some direct seeding acres out there as well. The biggest things where we're direct seeding, we got to be thinking number one, erosion control, Brian.
Yeah, so when you start thinking of using cover crops and companion crops, you're thinking erosion control. So that's why a lot of you'll see oats, barley, a lot of these crops go out with the alfalfa. I think the one thing to always keep in mind when you start using those is, are you trying to grow a good alfalfa crop or a good cover crop? So when it comes to seeding rate, I think it's pretty important to make sure you manage for alfalfa and not just the oat crop you're going to have out there. So those rates are usually going to be a little bit lower than you'd see, if you're just planting oats or barley by itself.
Yeah, and really those rates on that cover crop, whether we're using oats or barley, we'd like to see that 1 to 1.5 bushel on most of our soil types. If you got some lighter ground that's pretty sandy, we'd probably keep that back to a bushel just to try to minimize the competition from water and sunlight. And really, the other thing is, in some cases, we do want to manage the cover crop if it's something that you want to harvest and yield and keep it healthy. But the biggest thing, if we got to put a little nitrogen out there, we really don't want to see much more than 30 pounds of nitrogen for the cover crop. Any additional than that, you run a huge risk of getting too much vegetative growth, getting some weather and lodging that down and smothering out that important alfalfa crop that's growing underneath that cover crop.
Yeah, so Josh, switching gears, we talked a little about the seeding rate of the cover crop. What's the ideal seeding rate for the actual alfalfa that you're putting out in the field?
Yeah, so at that, really, if I just throw out one number, I'm usually going to throw out 15 pounds. I will say there are some situations where maybe we go a little bit higher than that, specifically around if we're using an airflow fertilizer machine to put that down. In the past, I've probably been maybe a little closer to 17 to 18 pounds than that, just to try to hedge myself a little bit. I know you got a simple rule you throw out there, about 3 acres per bag, and you'll be dialed in right on the money.
Yeah, that puts you within a pound or two. And if you're having any question when you're in the field, just try to remember, 1 bag will cover 3 acres, and that'll give you plenty out there. It's probably erring on the side of caution a little more than you need to, but it is a nice base point to go from.
Yeah. The other call out on seeding rate, it is important to look at your seed tag and look at some of the coating rates. You know, there are some big differences amongst the varieties that are out there, how much coating is on your seed. But those are some things you want to look at before you seed too, just to see, all right, based on my seed treatment or coating, how many seeds am I actually getting out there? And it's just something to take a look at because there are some major differences across the industry.
Yeah, it varies anywhere from, I think, 0 to 34%. So pretty significant when you think about the amount of pure live seed you have out there. If there's 34% clay or coating content, you know, you are going to have that many less seeds. You should really compensate a little bit for that.
Yep. So now that we got kind of the rate styled in, we know how much alfalfa we want per acre. If we're using a cover crop, we got that figured out. We're kind of rolling into getting that seed bed prep, and this is something that's extremely important because really when it comes to alfalfa, it's all about seed to soil contact. And Brian, the one thing that sometimes gets overlooked is what should the soil be like before we even go out there to seed it? And there's one simple rule around, as you're walking your field, what's the simple rule there, Brian?
Yeah, so if you're walking across your field, I think the common misconception is guys don't get it firm enough. So when you're walking across, your boot should sink in about 3/8 of an inch into that dirt profile. So that's why you see a lot of that pre-rolling before you'll seed, you know, especially in an air seeding situation, but even with, you know, some drills that are out there, you know, rolling it ahead of time can really firm it up and make that seed bed a lot better. But Josh, when you're really looking at rollers, smooth rollers don't always do the trick. You know, the cultipacker type rollers with that indentation is what really makes for a good seed bed in alfalfa.
Yeah, every year we run into some smooth rolling situations. You know, I know sometimes it's just what do you have available for you, but in most times where you see the rollers that a lot of growers using on rolling soybeans or things like that, those smooth barrel rollers, we tend to see a little bit of an issue there where maybe we're creating a smooth and we're getting a nice firm surface where you're not making an indentation when you walk across 3/8 of an inch, but you're really not creating those dimples that are going to give you the good seed to soil contact we're looking for. So looking across our area, you know, southern Minnesota and really most of Wisconsin, Brian, there's three major ways that we seed alfalfa. Number one, we use a grain drill, in most cases with press wheels. Number two, we're using a fertilizer air machine and blowing it down probably with some potash and maybe a little bit of DAP, depending on your soil test, and a Brilliant seeder, which kind of emulates that roller seed roller method. But let's kind of go through the seed prep for each one. First off, Brian, with a grain drill.
Yeah, so when you look at a grain drill, we talked a little bit about having that firmer base when you go out. So if you have a grain drill with press wheels, you're going to want it rolled ahead of time before you go out there to have that nice, you know, firm bed. You're going to go out there, roll it, and that press wheel in the back should take care of that second packing action. So you shouldn't need anything after the grain drill. Josh, if you look at air seeding, which is a little bit different, so what is the prep that you'd use for air seeding?
Yeah, the air seeding's pretty simple. If you got a big Brilliant roller, you roll it, you run the air machine across it, spread your fertilizer and seed, and you roll it again, and you're all good to go.
Yep. So the last piece there, Josh mentioned a little, was the Brilliant, which kind of is that same effect. It's just air seeding can cover a lot more acres a lot quicker. So The Brilliant, you go out into work ground with a field cultivator, you go through it, it's got a packer wheel in the front, that cultipacker roller, it drops the seed, and then it's got another one right behind it. So it has that same action, you know, the cultipacker, seed, cultipacker, and that really makes for a good stand too.
Yep. And if we look at these three methods, Brian, one of the most common things I'm seeing going on where it's maybe not the ideal is I have run into a lot of operators that where they're using the grain drill, they're doing like a field finisher pass, they're going across with the grain drill and press wheel and rolling it after. Where we mentioned before, we'd much rather see that rolled ahead of time, go over it with the grain drill and press wheels. But that's one of the most common, you know, errors that I'm seeing is they're not having that seed bed firm enough before they make the grain drill pass. And what's happening is we're actually the soil is so loose. We go across with the grain drill, we're getting it maybe a little deep, even with the grain drill and the press wheels. And by the time we press with the roller, you know, we're maybe getting it too deep, or the problem is, if we're not getting it too deep, is the seed bed is not firm enough below the seed. We're getting it pressed on top, but we want it firm bottom to top, and that's why we like it firm before we roll it in, as we get really firm, really good seed to soil contact from the bottom and the top, and that's really the key of the whole thing around seeding alfalfa.
Yeah, so I think if you recap that, you know, some key points there are, if you have a big weed problem coming out of winter annuals and you're going to no-till it, you know, control those weeds, or even if you're going to till it, control those weeds before we get the alfalfa out there. You know, number two, we talked 15 pounds per acre. You know, for easy math, you could probably run, you know, 1 bag to 3 acres. Besides that, seeding depth, you know, that 3/8 inch is ideal. 1/8 inch either way is great. And then the last thing for field prep, when you do walk out in that field, make sure it's firm enough where your boot's only dropping in 3/8 of an inch. So Josh, moving on here, we talked, we're going to say, some last call outs before planting season here. And, CRW is, I think, the first thing we want to call out, corn rootworm. So what are some thoughts you have on corn rootworm going into spring?
Pretty straightforward. Obviously, hopefully you got an understanding of what your beater pressure is. If you don't know, talk to your local Pioneer sales professional. They'll give you some insight, but really make sure you got the right trait. If you got some high pressure, specifically long-range corn on corn with high pressure, consider layering insecticide with that. And don't forget about extended diapause on the soybean ground. Brian, where we cover in southeast Minnesota, especially east of Highway 52, we saw that move in, and we don't want to overlook that moving into 2016 planting season.
Yep. So, Josh, around sulfur, what are some key takeaways you'd have for guys going into spring?
Just a simple rule. Again, it varies a little bit by geography and organic matter and crop rotation. But if the simple rule: do I have enough sulfur for a high-producing corn crop? Look at your nitrogen to sulfur ratio. Ideally, we'd like that nitrogen to sulfur ratio being around 6 to 7 to 1. So basically, for every 6 to 7 pounds of nitrogen, we want a pound of sulfur. That's just a simple rule to look at. Hey, what are we planning on doing? If you fall in that realm, you're likely good to go. If you're a little short of that, maybe talk to some people and see if you need some additional sulfur based on your individual operation.
Yeah, when you think about it, make sure it's in your program, right? That's the first thing.
Yes.
Just make sure it's
exactly.
in there. It's one of the things we probably go on calls with the most is sulfur deficiency.
Absolutely.
So, next P&K going into spring, where's it needed the most?
Been the hottest topic of the winter on the crop shop tour is what I need to do with P&K. In most cases, if you got good P&K, maintenance is critical. If you got some farms where you got some really high levels and low levels, just redirect those those pounds. It's just a year with a cookie cutter program where I'm going to do the same thing on every acre. Got to put the dollars where we're going to get the most return on investment.
Yeah, and finally, seed bed preparation going into spring.
Critical for corn. We just talked about it in alfalfa. It's also extremely important in corn. The biggest thing is, can we get, we'd like to see a fairly nice firm seed bed for corn as well. And then from there, it's just getting the conditions right. Hopefully, get it worked ahead of time. Give it that day to dry out if at all possible. Make sure you're checking your depth, especially out of the gate. But the big thing is make sure you're following that through farm to farm. Conditions vary every field. Just stay diligent of keep making sure that planter's putting the seeds where you want them. So many times we see people, they set it and just kind of roll it through and conditions change. And next thing you know, they're planting a half-inch deep. And, the planter leaves the field and they're potentially at a pretty big yield loss before the corn even germinated. That's what we like to avoid.
Yeah, it's so hard to get that extra 5-10 bushel. Don't lose it by not checking planting depth or something simple like that. Just make sure you're ready to go. Make sure the soil's fit. Even 24 hours can really change, how good that soil condition is for planting. So I think we had a good show here today, Josh.
Yeah, I think one thing, Brian, we don't call out, if you get this or you see our podcast, where do you find it? Sometimes we tweet it out, you get emails, but if you lost the email or don't have us on Twitter, just go to youtube.com, search Brian Buck or Josh Shofner, followed by Pioneer. You'll get a list of all the shows that we got out there. Brian, Twitter is a good way to follow us. What's your Twitter handle?
I'm at FarmerBuck1.
And I am at Josh Shofner.
Well, Josh, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This podcast is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a bi-weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next time.